The identification came within the hour, delivered by Inspector Hartley himself, a man whose career had been spent in the tedious examination of village mishaps and the occasional crime born more of passion than premeditation. The body belonged to James Wickham, Thomas Wickham's nephew, a man who had inherited the property some 8 years prior, but had chosen to leave it in its deteriorating state rather than invest in its restoration. The news rippled through Thornfield with the force of genuine scandal, for James Wickham had been neither unknown nor particularly liked, and his death under unclear circumstances provided the village with the sort of narrative complexity that could sustain gossip for months. By evening, as Miss Marple settled into a comfortable sitting room with a cup of Darjeeling and her knitting, the preliminary facts had begun to crystallize through the village's efficient grapevine. James Wickham had been discovered in the old barn, beneath a pile of rotting timber and debris, his skull bearing evidence of a considerable blow. The initial assessment suggested he might have been working on the property, perhaps attempting repairs, when the structure had given way catastrophically. However, the presence of what appeared to be a deliberately laid trap, several heavy beams arranged in a manner that suggested intentional stacking rather than accidental collapse, had prompted the police to preserve the scene and conduct a more thorough examination. Miss Marple's telephone rang at 8:30, a sound she had been rather expecting. It was her old friend Constance Miller, a woman whose position as the wife of the former headmaster and whose keen attention to village affairs made her an invaluable source of detail without any of the sting of mere gossip. Constance spoke in the measured tones of one imparting significant information, relating how the police had already begun interviewing those who had known Wickham, and how certain facts were beginning to emerge that complicated the simple narrative of accidental death. James Wickham, it transpired, had been in debt, considerable debt, and had recently begun approaching several villagers with requests for loans that bordered on desperation. Moreover, his relationship with his tenant farmer, who occupied the cottage on the property's eastern boundary, had deteriorated markedly in recent months over the question of water rights and a disputed boundary line. There was more, Constance confided, leaning conspiratorially into the telephone despite speaking to someone she had known for 40 years. It appeared that Wickham had begun making inquiries about selling the property and not to sympathetic parties. He had engaged an aggressive developer from the city, a man with a reputation for transforming pastoral landscapes into commercial ventures, and preliminary discussions suggested the farm might be converted into a leisure complex or residential development. This news had understandably distressed those whose properties adjoined the farm or who held sentimental attachments to the village's remaining agricultural character. And Inspector Hartley was apparently interested in determining who among Wickham's acquaintances had possessed both motive and opportunity. After disconnecting from Constance, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence, her knitting needles still and her hands folded in her lap. She had lived long enough to understand that motives proliferated in complex situations like mushrooms in damp soil, and that the initial suspect invariably proved either guilty or innocently harmed by circumstantial association with facts that merely appeared damning. What intrigued her, however, was not the obvious motives, the debt, the boundary disputes, the threatened development, but rather the manner of death itself and what it suggested about the killer's knowledge and psychology. An accident would have left no questions. A simple blow delivered in anger might have spoken of passion or momentary loss of control. But this arrangement of beams, this careful construction of what appeared to be a deliberate trap, suggested someone possessed of patience and planning. Someone who had thought through not merely the act of murder, but its execution with the precision of someone accustomed to solving logistical problems methodically. This meant the killer was likely someone of intelligence and temperament, not someone easily flustered or prone to panic. And these qualities appeared in distinct patterns throughout human society. Patterns that Miss Marple had observed repeatedly across the decades of her life. The following morning brought Inspector Hartley himself to her cottage. A courtesy call that suggested her reputation for helpful observation had preceded her. He was a competent man, perhaps 55, with the slightly worn appearance of someone who had spent his career managing the intersection between human behavior and the law's rigid requirements. He sat in her comfortable armchair, accepted a cup of tea with evident gratitude, and related the preliminary findings with the careful tone of one seeking information rather than merely providing it. The circumstances, he explained, remained ambiguous. Wickham's death could have resulted from an accident. Genuine though unlikely, it could have been murder disguised as accident, which appeared increasingly probable, or there existed the remote possibility that Wickham himself had somehow engineered the trap and met his own demise through miscalculation. This last option seemed to Inspector Hartley personally improbable, and Miss Marple agreed, though for reasons she did not immediately articulate. What she did express was a gentle curiosity about the village's reactions, and whether the inspector had observed anything in people's responses that struck him as unusual or revealing. It was a question asked so innocuously, with such apparent innocence of purpose, that the inspector answered fully and with surprising candor, describing reactions he had observed and theories he had noted. Miss Marple listened with the complete attention of someone to whom courtesy of listening had become her primary art. And as she watched his face and heard the careful cadence of his words, she began to construct in her mind the outline of a problem that would require the full measure of her understanding of human nature before its solution could emerge into clarity. After the inspector's departure, Miss Marple found herself drawn to walk through the village, a habit that her doctor had recommended for her circulation and which conveniently allowed her to observe the human landscape in motion rather than through the filtered accounts of others. The afternoon was cool and overcast, the sort of English weather that seemed to seep melancholy into the very fabric of daily life. And she made her way first toward the village center, where the post office and the small general shop provided the natural gathering places for those who possessed both the leisure and inclination to exchange information. Mrs. Hetherington, who operated the post office with the efficient authority of someone who believed correspondence was a sacred trust, was in her customary position behind the counter when Miss Marple entered, and the younger woman's face brightened with the particular pleasure that comes from having a significant piece of information to impart to someone whose judgment one respected. The consensus, Mrs. Hetherington explained while sorting letters with practiced efficiency, seemed to be settling around Gerald Blackwood as the most likely suspect, a theory that appeared to have originated with the village's more imaginative residents, but had grown increasingly plausible as details emerged. The connection was neither simple nor obvious, but it was apparently rooted in a business arrangement that had apparently turned acrimonious some months prior. Blackwood, as chairman of the council, had supported a planning application from Wickham for a small extension to the farm cottage. And when the application had subsequently been withdrawn without explanation, certain parties had suggested that financial arrangements might have been involved, though no one could articulate precisely what those arrangements might have been, or why they would have created animosity sufficient to motivate murder. Miss Marple listened with her characteristic expression of gentle interest, asking occasional questions that appeared to be about inconsequential details, but which actually served to deepen her understanding of the timeline and the specific nature of relationships involved. She learned that Blackwood's wife, Margaret, had been observed in what one witness described as a state, visible distress manifesting itself in ways that suggested anxiety beyond ordinary concern about scandal. She learned that Timothy Ashford had been seen at the field gate on the morning of Wickham's death, an encounter that Ashford himself had not voluntarily mentioned to the police, though he claimed upon questioning that he had simply been taking a constitutional walk and had noted with disgust the deteriorating state of the property. She learned, most intriguingly, that Catherine Hargreaves had visited Fieldgate Farm 3 days before the murder and had spent nearly 2 hours inside the main house, a visit that seemed incongruous given that the Hargreaves family possessed no obvious connection to Wickham that anyone could identify. Leaving the post office, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where the Reverend David Summers was tending to the flower beds with the devotion he brought to all parish matters. The Reverend was a man of genuine goodness, the sort of clergyman who believed that understanding people's circumstances was essential to offering spiritual guidance, and he therefore possessed a knowledge of his parishioners' situations that would have rivaled the police inspector's own intelligence gathering. Over a discussion ostensibly about the church's flower rota, Miss Marple managed to extract a clearer picture of the emotional landscape that underlay the village's surface civility. The Reverend spoke with genuine concern about Gerald Blackwood, whose confidence seemed to have been shaken by something. Though whether it was connected to the murder investigation or preceded it, the Reverend could not say with certainty. He expressed worry about Margaret Blackwood, who had ceased attending her usual committees and seemed to have withdrawn into a private sphere of anxiety. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Catherine Hargreaves had sought his counsel recently and had been deeply troubled by matters of conscience, though she had not been willing to divulge their specific nature, and clerical confidentiality prevented him from pressing her further. Most significantly, perhaps, he noted that the relationship between Michael Hargreaves and his wife Catherine had become visibly strained in recent weeks, with the couple maintaining an almost formal politeness that suggested some fundamental breach in their understanding. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the late afternoon had settled into early evening, and she prepared her supper with the methodical care she brought to all tasks, her mind working through the emerging patterns like someone solving a complex puzzle without the benefit of seeing the picture on the box. What she possessed so far were fragments: a financial arrangement involving Blackwood and Wickham, Catherine Hargreaves' mysterious visit to the farm, Timothy Ashford's convenient coincidence of being near the murder scene, the strained marriage of the Hargreaves, Margaret Blackwood's evident distress, and the manner of death itself, which suggested planning and knowledge. She thought about how human beings consistently revealed themselves through their reactions to crisis, through the small tells and evasions that betrayed what they most wished to conceal. She considered the structure of the trap that had killed Wickham, the intentionality embedded in its construction, and what such planning revealed about the killer's character and circumstances. As darkness fell completely and she sat in her comfortable chair with her knitting, the needles clicking their familiar rhythm, Miss Marple began to suspect that the truth would ultimately prove more complex and more human than either the police inspector's initial theories or the village's gossip-fueled speculation had yet imagined. And she settled herself for the patient work of observation and deduction that would be necessary to draw that truth into the light. The following morning brought rain, a steady precipitation that transformed the village into something resembling an impressionist painting, all soft edges and muted colors, and Miss Marple received a visitor before 9 o'clock, a development that suggested urgency on someone's part. It was Timothy Ashford who arrived at her door, his dark hair dampened by rain and his expression bearing the peculiar mixture of defiance and anxiety that characterizes those who have decided to speak truth reluctantly. She invited him into her parlor with the same graciousness she would have extended to any caller, and as he sat uncomfortably on the edge of her best chair, still in his damp coat, she offered him tea and waited with patient silence for him to articulate whatever had driven him to seek her counsel. Timothy's words, when they came, emerged in fragments and starts, suggesting a young man wrestling with competing loyalties and the fear of consequences. He had indeed been at Fieldgate Farm on the morning of Wickham's death, he admitted, but not for the innocent constitutional walk he had claimed. He had been there at Catherine Hargreaves' request, delivering to Wickham a message and a sum of money that Catherine had entrusted to him with explicit instructions that he mention this transaction to no one. The reason for this secrecy, Timothy explained with obvious discomfort, related to matters he felt deeply uncomfortable discussing, but which he now recognized might be relevant to the police investigation. Catherine Hargreaves, it appeared, had been involved in some form of financial arrangement with Wickham, something that predated the recent events and which concerned a property matter that Timothy himself did not fully understand. What he did understand was that Catherine's husband Michael knew nothing of these transactions, and that Catherine had been desperately trying to resolve whatever situation had developed before it became public knowledge that might harm her marriage. Miss Marple listened to this account with the expression of someone hearing nothing particularly remarkable, and her response, when it came, was simply to ask whether Timothy believed Catherine Hargreaves capable of murder. The question seemed to startle him, and he sat in silence for a long moment before responding that he did not, that whatever Catherine's faults might be, she possessed a fundamental goodness that precluded such an act. Miss Marple then asked, with the same gentle tone, whether Timothy himself possessed any financial interest in Wickham's property or its potential development, a question that occasioned another visible shock before he assured her truthfully that he did not. Only after these foundational matters had been established did Miss Marple suggest that Timothy might find it in his best interest to speak with Inspector Hartley and provide a truthful account of his morning visit to the farm, emphasizing that honesty regarding his presence would ultimately serve him better than continued evasion. The young man departed some minutes later, looking somewhat relieved despite the obvious anxiety of facing the police, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting with the satisfaction of someone who had just moved a chess piece into a more advantageous position. That afternoon, as the rain continued its steady work of transformation, Miss Marple received a telephone call from Constance Miller, whose voice carried notes of barely suppressed excitement and concern in equal measure. The police investigation had apparently accelerated following some new development that Constance's sources suggested involved Timothy Ashford's confession and its implications for understanding the financial arrangements at Fieldgate Farm. More significantly and more troubling, it appeared that a second examination of Wickham's property had uncovered documentation suggesting that Gerald Blackwood had engaged in a considerable financial transaction with Wickham some 6 months prior. A transaction that appeared to involve not a loan or business arrangement, but rather something of a more problematic nature. The specifics remained unclear, but the transaction had apparently been substantial enough to constitute a motive for either party to wish the other harm, depending on how the arrangement had ultimately resolved. Constance further reported that Margaret Blackwood had apparently suffered what the village was diplomatically describing as a nervous collapse, and had been taken to a private nursing facility outside the village where she might recover from her evident distress in a more controlled environment. This news struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, and she spent considerable time in conversation with Constance, exploring the timeline of Margaret's deterioration and whether it corresponded with any specific event or revelation in the investigation. After the telephone conversation concluded, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the pattern that was beginning to emerge from the accumulated details. She thought about how secrets in villages accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of concealment and evasion, until the weight of them became unbearable, and truth began to leak through the cracks. She considered Gerald Blackwood, a man of public position and apparent respectability, and wondered what circumstances might have driven him to engage in financial transactions with someone like Wickham that required such careful concealment from his wife. She thought about Catherine Hargreaves and her desperate attempts to manage a situation that threatened her marriage, and about Michael Hargreaves' apparent ignorance of his wife's involvement in matters at Fieldgate Farm. Most of all, she thought about the manner of Wickham's death, about the deliberate construction of that trap, and what it revealed about someone who possessed both the knowledge to devise it and the determination to see it through. As evening approached and the rain began to ease, Miss Marple composed a small note requesting that Inspector Hartley visit her at his earliest convenience, as she believed she had observed something that might prove relevant to his investigation. A communication sent with the casual tone of someone simply performing a civic duty rather than someone who had begun to perceive the true architecture of guilt beneath the village's surface civility. Inspector Hartley arrived the following morning with the aspect of a man whose investigation had reached a critical juncture and who believed that outside perspective might illuminate aspects he had overlooked. He carried a leather folder containing photographs and documents related to the case, and his manner toward Miss Marple had subtly shifted from courtesy toward something approaching genuine deference, as though he had begun to recognize that her observations operated on a level of sophistication that his procedural approach could not entirely encompass. Over tea and biscuits, he laid out the facts that his investigation had uncovered, speaking with the careful precision of someone accustomed to presenting evidence in contexts where accuracy was paramount. The financial transaction between Gerald Blackwood and James Wickham, it transpired, had involved a sum of approximately £15,000 transferred in cash some 8 months prior in what appeared to be a loan arrangement, though the paperwork documenting such loan was entirely absent. Wickham, shortly before his death, had apparently begun making demands for repayment of this sum, and when Blackwood had proved unable or unwilling to comply, the situation had deteriorated into what witnesses described as several heated confrontations. Moreover, the investigation had revealed that this transaction had occurred at precisely the moment when Blackwood was facing significant financial difficulties arising from unsuccessful property investments and the costs associated with maintaining his social position within the village. Catherine Hargreaves' involvement, the inspector explained, appeared to relate to a different matter entirely, one which involved her family's history and a property boundary dispute that had simmered for decades. It appeared that Fieldgate Farm had once belonged, indirectly, to Catherine's family, and she had apparently been attempting to negotiate with Wickham regarding the possibility of reclaiming a portion of the property or receiving compensation for what her family viewed as a historical injustice. Miss Marple listened to this exposition with the appearance of someone processing new information, though in fact much of what the inspector described aligned with the conclusions she had already reached through her own observations. What she found more interesting than the facts themselves was the inspector's evident conclusion that Gerald Blackwood represented the most probable suspect, a conclusion that seemed to her to rest upon logical foundations that were more apparent than actual. She posed a series of questions to the inspector, each phrased with such apparent innocence that the detective seemed almost unaware he was being interrogated. She asked whether it seemed likely that a man facing discovery would choose to kill his creditor in a manner that required considerable planning and knowledge, or whether panic and desperation more typically manifested themselves in sudden, violent acts. She asked whether the financial circumstances that had driven Blackwood to desperation might not similarly have affected others in the village, and whether anyone else might have possessed both motive and knowledge to construct the trap that had resulted in Wickham's death. She asked, most provocatively, whether the inspector had fully considered the possibility that the most obvious suspect might have been deliberately positioned in that role by someone far more cunning, someone who understood that Blackwood's financial difficulties and his connection to Wickham would naturally draw attention. Inspector Hartley sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from confidence toward genuine uncertainty, and Miss Marple could perceive the moment at which he recognized that his investigation, while thorough, had perhaps followed a path of least resistance rather than pursuing the more difficult truth. She then asked, with the delicacy of someone raising a sensitive matter, whether he had given particular attention to the question of who possessed detailed knowledge of Fieldgate Farm's structures, who would have known the condition of the barn's interior construction, and who would have possessed the practical expertise to construct the trap that had claimed Wickham's life. The inspector's face indicated that this angle had received less attention than it perhaps deserved, and Miss Marple proceeded carefully to suggest that such knowledge typically belonged to individuals with either professional experience in construction or long familiarity with a particular property. She further suggested that the timing of Wickham's death, coming as it did on the heels of his increasingly aggressive efforts to develop the property, implied that someone with a genuine stake in preventing that development might have possessed both motive and opportunity. Over the following hour, Miss Marple guided the inspector toward a reassessment of his assumptions, not through direct accusation but through the subtle Socratic method of questioning that seemed to lead him toward his own realization rather than toward conclusions she was presenting to him. She spoke, almost in passing, about how fear operated in human psychology, how individuals facing the prospect of losing something profoundly important to them might be driven to acts they would never otherwise contemplate. She mentioned, as though merely musing aloud, how the Hargreaves family had occupied their cottage on the boundary of Fieldgate Farm for 3 generations, and how the prospect of the property's development and transformation into a commercial venture would fundamentally alter the character of that rural landscape in which their history was rooted. She noted, with the tone of simple observation, that Michael Hargreaves possessed considerable experience in construction, having worked as a surveyor before his retirement, and that such a man would certainly possess the technical knowledge necessary to construct a trap of the sophistication that had been employed. By the time the inspector departed Miss Marple's cottage, he carried with him not accusations but something far more valuable, a reorientation of his investigation that would lead him toward evidence and testimony that had previously seemed peripheral to his central theory. The shift in the police investigation's focus produced the sort of subtle ripple through village society that only those attuned to the nuances of gossip and inference could properly appreciate. Though soon enough, the reorientation became obvious to all observers. Michael Hargreaves, who had previously occupied a peripheral position in the investigation's narrative, suddenly found himself subjected to considerably more intensive questioning, and his movements on the morning of Wickham's death were examined with the thoroughness that had previously been reserved for Gerald Blackwood. It was during this intensified scrutiny that a detail emerged which had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Michael Hargreaves had been observed by multiple witnesses entering Fieldgate Farm at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, a full hour before Wickham's body was discovered, and he had departed less than 30 minutes later, carrying what one witness described as a canvas bag of indeterminate contents. When questioned about this visit, Hargreaves initially claimed to have no recollection of it, a response so obviously false that it immediately compromised his credibility and raised the stakes considerably. Under more insistent questioning, he admitted to having visited the property but insisted that his purpose had been innocent, involving merely a conversation with Wickham regarding boundary maintenance and drainage issues that affected both properties. However, the emerging timeline suggested that if such a conversation had occurred, it must have been brief indeed, insufficient time for the sort of detailed discussion that boundary and drainage matters typically required. Miss Marple observed these developments through the village's efficient information network, and while she maintained her customary exterior of gentle detachment, internally she was engaged in the delicate work of distinguishing between what the evidence suggested and what the deeper patterns of human behavior implied. It was on the afternoon of the 4th day, following the intensification of focus on Michael Hargreaves, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor in the form of Catherine Hargreaves herself, a woman whose usual composure had fractured entirely, leaving visible the anxiety and desperation that had previously been carefully masked beneath social convention. Catherine's arrival at Miss Marple's door was accompanied by visible distress, her hands trembling and her eyes bearing the reddened appearance of prolonged weeping, and Miss Marple immediately recognized that this was a woman approaching a critical decision point. She ushered Catherine into her parlor and allowed her to sit in silence for several minutes before speaking, a courtesy that Catherine seemed to appreciate beyond measure. When Catherine finally found words, they emerged in a rush of confession that suggested the burden of secrecy had become unbearable. She revealed that she had indeed engaged in financial negotiations with Wickham regarding the property, but not for the reasons the police believed. Years ago, when Catherine's own family had experienced financial difficulties, Wickham's uncle had purchased a portion of their ancestral land at a price far below its genuine value. a transaction that had never been properly documented, but which had always rankled within her family consciousness. Recently, Catherine had learned that this transaction might be reversible through legal action, and she had been attempting to negotiate with Wickham for either restitution or the return of the property. However, what the police did not understand was that Michael had known nothing of these negotiations, because Michael himself harbored a profound resentment of Wickham that far exceeded the boundary disputes that officially characterized their relationship. The resentment, Catherine explained with evident pain, stemmed from events that had occurred years prior, from circumstances that had wounded Michael so profoundly that he could never quite articulate them, but which had left him with an almost pathological aversion to the prospect of Wickham's development plans, destroying the rural landscape that represented everything Michael valued about their life. Miss Marple listened to this account with her characteristic quietness, and what emerged from Catherine's testimony was a portrait of a household divided by secrets, where each family member harbored private grievances and pursued individual agendas without full knowledge of the other's activities. Catherine insisted with desperate emphasis that Michael could not have killed Wickham, that despite his rage and resentment, he simply lacked the capacity for such an act. And she seemed to be attempting to convince herself as much as Miss Marple of this fundamental truth. She described her husband as fundamentally decent, a man whose anger burned hot but briefly, incapable of the patient planning that the murder appeared to require. Yet even as she defended him, Miss Marple could perceive the doubt that Catherine harbored, the terrible uncertainty of whether one truly knows the capacity for violence that exists within someone one loves. After Catherine's departure, leaving behind her the residue of her anxiety and desperation, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor and contemplated the architecture of deception that the investigation had begun to reveal. She thought about how secrets accumulated within families like sediment, how the failure of communication between married partners could create spaces where resentment festered and grew. She considered Michael Hargreaves, a man wounded by history and endangered by the prospect of loss, a man possessed of the technical knowledge to construct a lethal trap, a man whose movements on the morning of the murder remained inadequately explained. Yet something in the psychological profile still failed to align precisely with the crime. Some element that suggested either Michael was not the killer or that his motivation was not precisely what the surface evidence implied. Miss Marple decided that she would need to observe Michael Hargreaves directly, to see whether his demeanor and reactions would confirm or contradict the theory that was beginning to crystallize in her mind. A theory considerably more complex and considerably more damning than the straightforward narrative of a desperate man murdering his nemesis. The opportunity for direct observation came sooner than Miss Marple had anticipated, manifesting itself in the form of a village council meeting that had been scheduled weeks prior, but which had acquired an entirely different character in light of recent events. The meeting was called for 7 o'clock in the evening at the village hall, ostensibly to discuss routine administrative matters. But everyone understood that the proceedings would inevitably turn toward the murder investigation and its implications for the village's social fabric. Miss Marple attended with the stated purpose of observing the council's handling of a matter regarding the church flower fund, though her true interest lay in observing the interactions between the key figures whose secrets and motives had begun to constitute the landscape of this investigation. She positioned herself in the back of the modest assembly hall, her knitting needles occupied with a half-finished sock, her appearance so entirely benign that most attendees seemed scarcely to register her presence. The council members sat at a long table at the front of the hall, and it was Michael Hargreaves' demeanor that immediately claimed Miss Marple's attention. He sat with visible tension, his jaw clenched, and his eyes holding an expression of barely contained rage that suggested the weight of the police investigation's scrutiny had begun to fracture his composure. Beside him, Catherine sat with her hands folded in her lap, her attention focused on her husband with the intensity of someone monitoring a volatile substance. Gerald Blackwood was present as well, his position as council chairman giving him a nominal role in the proceedings, though his manner was subdued in a way that suggested the investigation's recent redirection had provided him with relief rather than exoneration. The meeting progressed through its initial business with the sort of desultory attention that characterized village governance during periods of social crisis. But when Reverend Summers raised the matter of offering pastoral support to those affected by the tragedy, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. It was Michael Hargreaves who responded to the Reverend's gentle suggestion, and his response revealed far more than any confession might have accomplished. He spoke with barely suppressed venom about Wickham, describing him not merely as a threat to local property values or family interests, but as a man whose very presence in the village represented a fundamental corruption of everything that made rural life valuable. His words carried the weight of accumulated grievance extending far beyond the recent development proposal, suggesting that Wickham had become, in Michael's psychological landscape, a symbol of forces threatening to destroy everything he held sacred. As he spoke, Miss Marple observed Catherine's face, shifting through expressions of alarm and despair. And she recognized in that shifting landscape of emotion the dawning realization that her husband's rage exceeded what she had previously understood or acknowledged. When Michael finally fell silent, the council chamber remained quiet, the weight of his barely contained violence hanging in the air like a physical presence. It was Gerald Blackwood who eventually spoke, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern as he suggested that perhaps Michael might benefit from a temporary respite from council duties. An observation that occasioned a reaction so violent in its intensity that two other council members moved with visible discomfort. Miss Marple noted with precision the exact moment at which Michael's control fractured, the specific words that triggered his response, and the manner in which Catherine reached for his arm in an attempt to restrain him. After the meeting concluded in its uncomfortable fashion, with several attendees departing with visible haste and others lingering in small clusters engaged in intense conversation, Miss Marple remained in her seat for some minutes, her knitting needles continuing their rhythmic work while her mind processed what she had observed. She had come to the meeting seeking to determine whether Michael Hargreaves possessed the psychological capacity to commit the murder that the evidence increasingly suggested he had perpetrated. And what she had witnessed was not definitive proof, but rather something considerably more valuable. A revelation of the depth and nature of Michael's emotional disturbance regarding Wickham. The intensity of his rage, the way it seemed to extend beyond rational grievance into something more pathological and consuming, suggested a man whose judgment had been significantly compromised by passion. Yet passion, in Miss Marple's extensive experience, frequently cloaked more calculated motivations, and she remained uncertain whether Michael's evident rage was the primary driver of the murder or whether it masked something considerably more deliberate and premeditated. The following morning brought a telephone call from Inspector Hartley, whose voice carried notes of genuine frustration and uncertainty. The investigation had reached an impasse, he explained, because while Michael Hargreaves remained the most obvious suspect based on motive and technical knowledge, the actual evidence connecting him directly to the murder remained circumstantial and insufficient to support charges. No physical evidence had been recovered linking Hargreaves to the crime scene, no witnesses had observed him constructing the trap, and his timeline, while suspicious, was not conclusively inconsistent with his account of a brief morning visit to discuss property matters. The inspector seemed to be seeking validation for proceeding with charges despite the evidentiary gaps. But Miss Marple instead posed a question that suggested a different line of inquiry entirely. She asked whether the inspector had fully explored the psychological relationship between Michael and Catherine Hargreaves, and whether he had considered the possibility that guilt for the murder might not rest with a single individual, but rather might be distributed across multiple people whose separate actions and silences had ultimately conspired to achieve Wickham's death. The inspector's silence on the other end of the line suggested profound discomfort with this suggestion, for it implied a complexity that would require considerably more investigation, and that might ultimately prove more difficult to prosecute than a straightforward case of a single individual driven to murder by passion and resentment. The suggestion of shared guilt appeared to have catalyzed a shift in the inspector's approach. For within 2 days, he had requested that both Michael and Catherine Hargreaves present themselves at the police station for extended questioning. A development that sent fresh tremors of anxiety through the village's already unsettled population. Miss Marple learned of this summons through Constance Miller, whose informants extended even into the police station itself. And she recognized in this development the beginning of the final phase of the investigation, the moment at which secrets would begin to unravel under the pressure of formal interrogation. She spent the afternoon of their questioning in quiet contemplation of the patterns she had observed, attempting to construct a coherent narrative that would account for all the disparate facts and behaviors that the investigation had uncovered. What she had come to suspect was not a simple story of murderer and victim, but rather a more intricate arrangement of human weakness and desperation in which multiple parties had played their roles, some consciously and some with only partial awareness of the consequences their actions would precipitate. That evening, as darkness fell and the village settled into the uncomfortable silence that follows days of intense social drama, Miss Marple made a decision that would prove to be the pivotal moment of the entire investigation. She composed a letter to Inspector Hartley, written in her careful hand with the deliberation of someone choosing words with precision, in which she outlined her theory regarding the murder and identified the individual whom she believed to be the genuine architect of Wickham's death. The letter was delivered by hand the following morning, and within hours Inspector Hartley appeared at Miss Marple's door with an expression that suggested he had undergone a fundamental reorientation of his understanding regarding the crime. He came alone, without subordinates, and his manner toward Miss Marple had shifted from deference toward something approaching genuine partnership in the investigation. They sat together in her parlor, and Miss Marple proceeded to lay out her theory with the same methodical precision that she brought to all matters of significance. She began by noting that the trap which had killed Wickham required not merely knowledge of the property's structure, but also considerable time and planning to construct. Time that would be difficult to conceal from one's immediate family unless one possessed legitimate reasons to be at the property during unusual hours. She observed that Michael Hargreaves, despite his obvious rage and his evident motive to see Wickham dead, lacked the methodical patience that such planning would require, his temperament being one that burned hot and immediate rather than cold and calculating. She noted that Catherine Hargreaves possessed neither the physical strength nor the technical knowledge to construct such a trap independently, though she might have possessed the knowledge to understand what her husband was planning if such planning had occurred. What had struck Miss Marple most forcefully, however, was a detail that the investigation had largely overlooked. The specific construction of the trap suggested knowledge not merely of the barn's structure, but of Wickham's habitual movements through the property, his patterns of work and routine. This knowledge, Miss Marple suggested, would most naturally be possessed by someone who had spent considerable time at Fieldgate Farm in recent weeks, someone whose presence would not provoke suspicion or comment. Inspector Hartley listened with growing comprehension as Miss Marple outlined her reasoning, and she perceived the moment at which he recognized the logical implications of her observation. The person with the greatest access to Fieldgate Farm in recent weeks, with legitimate reasons to be present and to observe Wickham's routines, was Timothy Ashford. The architect had been conducting preliminary assessments of the property's potential for development on Wickham's behalf, work that would have required him to spend considerable time on the property, examining its structures and considering renovation possibilities. Moreover, Miss Marple noted, Timothy possessed the technical knowledge that such planning would require, his architectural training having equipped him with understanding of structural design and engineering principles. The motive, while less obvious than those that had animated Michael and Catherine Hargreaves, nonetheless existed. Timothy had been displaced from Thornfield years prior, had struggled to establish himself in London, and had returned to his native village to find that Wickham's proposed development threatened to destroy the rural character that represented his emotional connection to his homeland. Additionally, and perhaps most significantly, Timothy harbored a connection to Catherine Hargreaves that the investigation had failed to uncover. A romantic attachment of years' standing that had gone unacknowledged, but which had created in him a form of jealousy regarding Michael Hargreaves, and a desire to protect Catherine from the consequences of Michael's rage. Miss Marple explained that what had likely occurred was a complex arrangement of actions and silences in which Timothy had constructed the trap with the deliberate intention of allowing evidence to point toward Michael Hargreaves, whose obvious motive and rage made him a plausible suspect. Timothy had then positioned himself so that his presence at the property on the morning of the murder would appear coincidental, and had later, when questioned by police, provided a carefully constructed account that deflected suspicion while maintaining plausible deniability. Michael Hargreaves had visited the property on the morning of the murder, but had encountered the trap already in place, a discovery that had horrified him and led to his initial evasion regarding the visit. Catherine, discovering her husband's knowledge of the murder and his subsequent silence, had been thrown into profound moral distress, not knowing whether Michael had perpetrated the crime or merely discovered it and chosen concealment. Inspector Hartley sat in silence for a long moment after Miss Marple completed her exposition, and when he finally spoke, it was with the tone of someone who had been forced to acknowledge that the investigation had followed paths determined by obvious motives and surface appearances, when the true perpetrator had been someone far more subtle in his calculation and considerably more aware of human psychology than the police had given him credit for. The confrontation between Inspector Hartley and Timothy Ashford took place in the interrogation room at the police station, a sterile environment that stripped away the social niceties and carefully constructed presentations that had characterized their previous interactions. Miss Marple did not attend this confrontation, understanding that her presence would be counterproductive, and that the inspector required the space to conduct his questioning without the complication of her involvement, though she had been informed that she might be called upon to provide testimony should the case proceed to prosecution. Instead, she remained in her cottage, occupied with her knitting and the particular form of mental reflection that she reserved for moments when she had exhausted the external aspects of an investigation and required time to process the emotional and philosophical dimensions of what she had uncovered. It was late evening when Constance Miller telephoned with the news that Timothy had confessed to the murder, though his confession came qualified with substantial explanation regarding his motivations and the circumstances that had driven him toward the act. The confession had emerged only after Inspector Hartley had presented him with evidence that Miss Marple's theory had motivated him to pursue more aggressively. Evidence involving Timothy's movements on the property, materials purchased from a local hardware supplier, and detailed architectural drawings found among Timothy's personal effects that depicted the barn structure with annotations indicating load-bearing elements and structural weak points. Timothy had initially attempted to maintain his innocence, but the accumulation of detail had proven overwhelming, and he had finally acknowledged the full extent of his actions, while simultaneously attempting to construct a narrative in which his culpability was mitigated by circumstance and motivation. According to Constance's account of what had transpired in the interrogation room, Timothy had explained that his initial involvement with the property had been entirely innocent, limited to his work as an architect assessing the development potential that Wickham had commissioned. However, as he had spent time at Fieldgate Farm, observing its structures and considering renovation possibilities, he had become increasingly disturbed by the prospect of development that would fundamentally alter the landscape of his childhood. More significantly, he had become aware through village gossip and direct observation of the distress that Wickham's development plans were causing to Catherine Hargreaves, a woman for whom Timothy harbored feelings that extended far beyond simple friendship or casual affection. He had convinced himself that by preventing the development, By removing Wickham from the equation, he would be protecting not merely the landscape, but also Catherine herself from the consequences of what Michael's rage might eventually drive him to do. The logic was circular and self-justifying, the sort of reasoning that individuals engaged in when seeking to rationalize actions that they knew, on some fundamental level, to be wrong. Timothy had therefore begun the meticulous work of planning Wickham's death, selecting the barn as the location because his architectural knowledge suggested it to be the most vulnerable structure on the property, and designing a trap that would appear to be an accident, while actually requiring considerable deliberation to construct properly. Miss Marple listened to Constance's detailed account of the confession with the expression of someone hearing confirmation of conclusions she had already reached, though she found herself experiencing something more complex than simple satisfaction at having her theory validated. What she felt, predominantly, was a profound sadness at the waste of human potential that the case represented. At Timothy's squandering of his genuine talent and his capacity for good through an act motivated by romantic attachment and environmental concern that had become twisted into rationalization for murder. She thought about how Timothy had positioned the evidence in such a way as to implicate Michael Hargreaves, and she recognized in this aspect of his crime a form of cruelty that extended beyond the simple fact of Wickham's death. By allowing suspicion to fall upon Michael, Timothy had been prepared to permit the destruction of Michael and Catherine's marriage, to allow Catherine to suffer the agony of believing her husband guilty, or, alternatively, to force her to carry the burden of knowing he was innocent while maintaining silence. The complexity of Timothy's culpability extended far beyond the simple act of murder into the broader territory of manipulation and the weaponization of others' emotions for his own purposes. That night, Miss Marple found herself unable to engage with her customary evening activities, and instead sat in her darkened parlor contemplating the nature of judgment and accountability that the conclusion of this investigation had forced upon her consciousness. She had solved the mystery with the same precision and logic that she had applied to countless previous cases, had identified the guilty party, and provided the police with the reasoning necessary to secure a confession and eventual prosecution. Yet in doing so, she had also participated in the exposure of Timothy Ashford's guilt, in the machinery of justice that would condemn him for actions that, while undeniably murderous, had emerged from a tangle of motivations that included genuine love and environmental concern alongside darker impulses of jealousy and the desire to manipulate circumstances to his advantage. The village would move forward from this crisis, would gradually reintegrate itself into patterns of social normalcy, and would eventually relegate even so dramatic an event as a murder to the status of historical anecdote. The sort of story that was retold at gatherings as evidence of the village's dramatic past. Yet for those most directly involved, for Catherine and Michael Hargreaves attempting to reconstruct their marriage after the revelations that Timothy's crime had forced into the open, for Gerald Blackwood working to restore his reputation after the investigation's initial misdirection, for Timothy Ashford facing the consequences of his actions within the criminal justice system, the reverberations would continue for years, shaping the trajectory of their lives in ways that could not be fully calculated or predicted. Miss Marple recognized, as she had recognized many times before, that solving a mystery brought not resolution, but rather a different form of beginning. One in which the community had to learn to live with the knowledge of what had been hidden, what had been possible, and what capacity for darkness existed even within those individuals whom one had believed oneself to know thoroughly and completely. The week following Timothy Ashford's confession brought a peculiar form of anticlimax to Thornfield Village. The sort of deflation that characterizes communities after dramatic events have reached their resolution and normality must reassert itself despite the profound alterations that dramatic events inevitably produce in the social landscape. The police investigation formally concluded, with Inspector Hartley providing official statements to the press that emphasized the methodical nature of police work and the importance of careful observation in solving complex crimes. a presentation that Miss Marple recognized as diplomatically obscuring the extent to which her own insights had guided the investigation toward its conclusion. Timothy Ashford remained in custody pending trial, a legal proceeding that would not occur for several months, sufficient time for the intense emotions surrounding his arrest to cool, and for the community to begin processing what his crime revealed about the nature of people one believed oneself to know. It was during this interval of relative calm that Miss Marple received a visitor whose arrival surprised her considerably, though perhaps it should not have, given the complexities of human motivation and the way individuals often sought counsel from those whom they believed to possess genuine understanding of human nature. Catherine Hargreaves appeared at Miss Marple's door on an afternoon of weak autumn sunshine, her appearance considerably improved from the desperate state in which she had last visited, though her eyes still carried the marks of profound emotional trauma that time alone could not erase. She came bearing a cake she had baked, a gesture that seemed to Miss Marple to represent an attempt to re-establish normalcy and to express gratitude for the role Miss Marple had played in preventing her husband from being wrongfully convicted of a crime he had not perpetrated. They sat together in Miss Marple's parlor as they had before, but the atmosphere was markedly different, stripped now of the desperate urgency that had characterized Catherine's earlier visit and replaced instead with something more contemplative and sorrowful. Catherine explained that she and Michael were attempting to reconstruct their marriage, a process considerably complicated by the revelations that the investigation had forced into the open regarding both Michael's resentment of Wickham and her own secret negotiations with the dead man regarding property matters. Michael had been profoundly shaken by discovering that his wife had harbored significant secrets from him, just as Catherine had been shaken by the discovery that her husband's rage toward Wickham had extended to depths she had never quite appreciated or acknowledged. The work of rebuilding trust and communication that had been fractured by years of accumulated silence and unspoken grievance was proving considerably more difficult than either of them had anticipated, though both were committed to the effort. Catherine expressed to Miss Marple a sentiment that suggested she had been wrestling with questions of guilt and responsibility, wondering whether her own involvement with Wickham and her knowledge of Michael's rage had somehow contributed to creating the circumstances in which Timothy had felt justified in committing murder. Miss Marple listened with her characteristic attentiveness and responded with gentle firmness that while actions and inactions always possessed consequences that extended beyond their initial perpetrators, individual responsibility for crime remained fundamentally personal, and Catherine could not reasonably assign to herself accountability for Timothy's choices regarding his own conduct. The conversation then turned toward Timothy himself, and Catherine revealed with evident distress that she had received a letter from him while he remained in custody, a letter in which he had attempted to explain his motivations and had expressed regret that his actions had caused her suffering rather than the protection he had believed he was providing. The letter was troubling in its revelation of how thoroughly Timothy had constructed a narrative in which murder became not merely permissible but actually noble, a sacrifice undertaken on behalf of someone he loved and a landscape he valued. Catherine had brought the letter with her, and with some hesitation she offered it to Miss Marple for her consideration, believing that the elderly woman's perspective might provide clarity regarding what Timothy's words revealed about his psychological state and his capacity for future rehabilitation or reform. Miss Marple read the letter with careful attention, her expression revealing nothing of her internal reactions, though Catherine could perceive the slight tightening around her mouth that indicated concentration and the processing of significant information. When Miss Marple had finished reading, she returned the letter to Catherine and offered an observation that seemed to strike at the heart of what the letter revealed about Timothy's character and his capacity for self-deception. She noted that the letter demonstrated considerable eloquence and apparent sincerity in its expressions of regret. Yet beneath the surface eloquence lay a fundamental unwillingness to accept genuine responsibility for his actions. a persistent tendency to frame his crime as motivated primarily by concern for others, rather than acknowledging the darker impulses of jealousy and the desire for control that had animated his behavior. Catherine departed Miss Marple's cottage some time later with a sense of having received not comfort, but rather clarity. The sort of clarity that comes from having one's inchoate suspicions confirmed by someone whose judgment one trusts implicitly. Miss Marple stood at her window and watched Catherine walk away down the lane, a figure whose posture suggested both weariness and a kind of determination, and she found herself thinking about the trajectory that Catherine's life would likely follow in the years to come. The marriage with Michael would either survive the trauma of the investigation and the revelations it had produced, or it would founder under the weight of accumulated distrust and unspoken resentment, a determination that only time and the couple's own efforts could make. What seemed certain was that neither Michael nor Catherine would ever again experience the comfortable unconsciousness that had characterized their relationship before Wickham's death had forced them to acknowledge the gaps and silences that had accumulated between them. The investigation had served as a kind of revelation, not merely of Timothy's guilt, but of the broader patterns of concealment and self-deception that characterized the community as a whole, patterns that Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing and that she recognized as fundamental to human nature itself, neither particularly surprising nor particularly condemnable, but rather simply the inevitable product of individuals attempting to navigate existence while protecting themselves and those they loved from truths they found difficult to acknowledge. The trial of Timothy Ashford took place on a grey November morning, several months after his arrest and confession, in a courthouse situated in the neighboring county town, a venue chosen to ensure that the proceedings occurred at sufficient distance from Thornfield to minimize the disruption to village life, while still maintaining accessibility for those who wished to observe the legal process unfold. Miss Marple attended the trial, though not as a formal witness, her role in the investigation having been sufficiently indirect that the prosecution felt confident proceeding without calling her to testify regarding her reasoning and observations. Instead, she sat in the public gallery observing the proceedings with the same quiet intensity she brought to all matters of significance, watching as the legal machinery that her own deductions had set in motion ground forward with its inexorable logic toward inevitable conclusion. Timothy Ashford presented himself in the courtroom with an appearance considerably diminished from the confident young architect who had returned to Thornfield months prior. His hair grown longer, and his face bearing the marks of months spent in custody contemplating the consequences of his actions. He entered a guilty plea to the charge of murder, a decision that surprised some observers who had expected a more protracted legal battle, but which Miss Marple understood as reflecting Timothy's recognition that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and that any attempt at denial would only prolong the inevitable process of judgment and consequence. The sentencing hearing that followed the guilty plea was mercifully brief, the judge delivering a statement that characterized Timothy's crime as premeditated murder committed with calculated deliberation. A judgment that resulted in a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years before parole eligibility would be considered. As Timothy was led from the courtroom, he cast a single glance toward the gallery where Miss Marple sat, a glance that seemed to contain equal measures of acknowledgement and reproach, as though he held her responsible not merely for exposing his guilt, but for forcing him to confront the reality of what his actions had made him. In the weeks following the trial's conclusion, Thornfield Village gradually returned to the rhythms of ordinary existence, though with an undercurrent of unease that suggested the events surrounding Wickham's death had produced permanent alterations in the community's sense of itself and its capacity to understand those individuals who lived within its borders. Gerald Blackwood had largely rehabilitated his reputation through a combination of careful public relations and genuine philanthropic activities that redirected attention from his financial difficulties toward his commitment to village welfare, a strategy that Miss Marple recognized as both effective and somewhat cynical in its calculated appropriation of good works for purposes of reputation management. The Hargreaves family had gradually withdrawn from the public sphere, with Michael and Catherine maintaining a lower profile than had characterized their previous social engagement. their marriage apparently surviving the trauma of the investigation, though with a quality of formality that suggested genuine intimacy had not been fully restored. Dorothy Pemberton, the hostess of the garden party where the investigation had begun, had continued her social activities with the determination of someone refusing to allow dramatic events to disrupt the ordered patterns of her life. Though Miss Marple noted with interest that Dorothy's entertaining had taken on a slightly more cautious character, as though the events had reminded her that even the most carefully controlled social environments could harbor unexpected darkness. It was on a particularly cold afternoon in late November that Miss Marple received a final visit from Inspector Hartley, who came ostensibly to thank her for her assistance in solving the case, but who seemed to carry with him an undercurrent of something more complex than simple professional gratitude. They sat together in her parlor as they had before, and the inspector confessed, with evident reluctance, that he had been troubled by certain aspects of the case even after Timothy's confession and trial had formally concluded the investigation. He had come to wonder, he explained, whether Miss Marple's initial suggestion of shared culpability might not have possessed greater validity than the subsequent focus on Timothy as the sole perpetrator had allowed him to acknowledge. The evidence regarding Michael Hargreaves's knowledge of the trap, or at minimum his discovery of it on the morning of the murder, remained ambiguous and open to interpretation, and the inspector wondered whether Miss Marple believed that Michael might have possessed greater involvement in the crime than the final resolution had suggested. Miss Marple listened to this confession with her characteristic quietness, and when she responded, her words carried the weight of someone who had given considerable thought to the question, and who had arrived at conclusions that she believed important to articulate. She acknowledged that the evidence did indeed permit the interpretation that Michael had possessed knowledge of the trap prior to Wickham's death, and that such knowledge, combined with his evident desire to see Wickham dead, might suggest complicity in the murder beyond mere discovery of the trap after the fact. However, she observed, the question of whether Michael possessed actual knowledge of Timothy's intentions, or whether he had simply encountered the trap and made the decision to remain silent, was a question that could never be definitively answered through investigation or legal proceedings. And she wondered whether the inspector had considered that some truths existed in territories where legal proof could never reach them. The inspector departed Miss Marple's cottage in the gathering darkness of late afternoon, his expression suggesting that her response had provided not answers, but rather a kind of wisdom regarding the inherent limitations of investigation and justice in addressing the full complexity of human behavior. Miss Marple remained in her parlor as evening settled completely over the village, and she reflected, as she had reflected countless times before, on the nature of mystery and its relationship to human knowledge. The case of James Wickham's death had been solved in the formal sense, the guilty party identified and prosecuted, justice administered according to the mechanisms available to the legal system. Yet the deeper mysteries that the investigation had uncovered, the questions regarding what Michael Hargreaves had truly known and done, what Catherine had truly suspected and enabled through her silence, what Gerald Blackwood's financial transaction with Wickham had truly represented, these mysteries remained ultimately impervious to definitive resolution. Life in Thornfield would continue. The village would gradually incorporate the events surrounding Wickham's death into its history and memory, becoming eventually simply another of the local stories that were retold at gatherings as markers of the community's past. Miss Marple understood that this was how it must be. That complete understanding of human motivation and action was not merely difficult but fundamentally impossible, and that wisdom lay not in the pursuit of such complete understanding, but in accepting the limitations of knowledge, while maintaining nonetheless one's commitment to truth and justice within the bounds of what could be known and proven. As she picked up her knitting and the needles resumed their familiar rhythm, Miss Marple found in that rhythmic motion a kind of peace. The peace that comes from having fulfilled one's obligations as one understands them, and from accepting that some mysteries must remain eternal precisely because they involve the deepest and most unknowable aspects of human nature itself.